One of today's most creative social psychologists, Roy Baumeister, in his book Evil, Inside Human Cruelty and Aggression, examined evil from the perspective of both victim and perpetrator. And taking the perpetrator's perspective, he found that people who do things we see as evil, from spousal abuse all the way to genocide, rarely think they are doing anything wrong. They almost always see themselves as responding to attacks and provocation in ways that are justified. They often think that they themselves are victims, but of course you can see right through this tactic. You are good at understanding the biases that others use to protect their self-esteem. The disturbing part is that Baumeister shows us our own distortions as victims and as righteous advocates of victims. Almost everywhere Baumeister looked in the research literature, he found that victims often shared some of the blame. Most murders result from an escalating cycle of provocation and retaliation. Often, the corpse could just as easily have been the murderer. In half of all domestic disputes, both sides use violence. Baumeister points out that even in instances of obvious police brutality, such as the infamous videotaped beatings of Rodney King in Los Angeles in 1991, there is usually much more to the story than is shown on the news. News programs gain viewers by satisfying people's need to believe that evil stalks the land. Baumeister is an extraordinary social psychologist, in part because in his search for truth, he is unconcerned about political correctness. Sometimes evil falls out of a clear blue sky onto the head of an innocent victim, but most cases are much more complicated, and Baumeister is willing to violate the taboo against blaming the victim in order to understand what really happened. People usually have reasons for committing violence, and those reasons usually involve retaliation for a perceived injustice, or self-defense. This does not mean that both sides are equally to blame. Perpetrators often grossly overreact and misinterpret using self-serving biases. But Baumeister's point is that we have a deep need to understand violence and cruelty through what he calls the myth of pure evil. Of this myth's many parts, the most important are that evildoers are pure in their evil motives. They have no motives for their actions beyond sadism and greed. Victims are pure in their victimhood. They did nothing to bring about their victimization. And evil comes from outside and is associated with a group or force that attacks our group. Furthermore, anyone who questions the application of the myth, who dares muddy the waters of moral certainty, is in league with evil. The myth of pure evil is the ultimate self-serving bias, the ultimate form of naive realism, and it is the ultimate cause of most long-running cycles of violence, because both sides use it to lock themselves into a struggle. In another unsettling conclusion, Baumeister found that violence and cruelty have four main causes. The first two are obvious attributes of evil: greed, ambition, violence for direct personal gain, as in robbery, and sadism, pleasure in hurting people. But greed ambition explains only a small portion of violence, and sadism explains almost none. Outside of children's cartoons and horror films, people almost never hurt others for the sheer joy of hurting someone. The two biggest causes of evil are two that we think are good, and that we try to encourage in our children: high self-esteem and moral idealism. Having high self-esteem doesn't directly cause violence, but when someone's high esteem is unrealistic or narcissistic, it is easily threatened by reality. In reaction to those threats, people, particularly young men, often lash out violently. Baumeister questions the usefulness of programs that try raise children's self-esteem directly instead of by teaching them skills they can be proud of. Such direct enhancement can potentially foster unstable narcissism. Threatened self-esteem accounts for a large portion of violence at the individual level. But to really get a mass atrocity going, you need idealism, the belief that your violence is a means to a moral end. The major atrocities of the 20th century were carried out largely either by men who thought they were creating a utopia, or else by men who believed they were defending their homeland or tribe from attack. Idealism easily becomes dangerous because it brings with it, almost inevitably, the belief that the ends justify the means. If you are fighting for good or for God, what matters is the outcome, not the path. People have little respect for rules. We respect the moral principles that underlie most rules. But when a moral mission and legal rules are incompatible, we usually care more about the mission. The psychologist Linda Skitka finds that when people have strong moral feelings about a controversial issue, when they have a moral mandate, they care much less about procedural fairness in court cases. They want the good guys freed by any means and the bad guys convicted by any means.